You know how they say, "I never want to see you again," is usually just something people shout in the heat of the moment? Well, my ex-boyfriend Marcus really should have thought twice before screaming those exact words at me, especially since he was about to marry my cousin 3 months later, and I had absolutely zero intention of honoring his little request. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me back up and paint you the full picture of how spectacularly this whole thing unfolded, because trust me, this is one of those stories that gets better with every twisted detail. It started on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always our date nights, had been for 2 years running. Marcus and I had this whole routine, dinner at Romano's, maybe catch a movie, then back to his place where we'd talk about moving in together someday, maybe getting engaged after he finished his master's degree. You know, all those sweet little lies that keep you warm at night. I was running late that particular Tuesday because my boss had decided that 5 p.m. was the perfect time to dump a project revision on my desk. By the time I made it to Marcus's apartment, I was already rehearsing my apology. I had my key. He'd given it to me 6 months earlier with this whole speech about trust and commitment that I'm now realizing was probably just him practicing for someone else. The door was unlocked, which was weird because Marcus was paranoid about security. I could hear voices coming from the living room, and my first thought was that maybe his roommate Jake had friends over. I was actually relieved because it meant I could slip in, grab Marcus, and we could still make our reservation. I pushed the door open quietly, planning to surprise him, and that's when I heard her laugh, my cousin Stephanie's laugh. Now, let me tell you about Stephanie. Picture everything I'm not. Blonde where I'm brunette, curves where I'm angles, that effortless charm that makes everyone in the room gravitate toward her like she's got her own personal magnetic field. We'd grown up together, and I'd spent most of my childhood watching her win at everything while I came in second place. Dance recitals, school plays, even our grandmother's affection. Stephanie always got the bigger slice of whatever pie was being served. But we were family, right? And family doesn't cross certain lines. Except apparently they do. I froze in the hallway, my brain trying to process why my cousin was in my boyfriend's apartment on our date night. The logical part of my mind was frantically offering up innocent explanations. Maybe she needed help with something, maybe it was a surprise for someone's birthday, maybe the universe wasn't actually imploding right in front of me. Then Marcus spoke, and his voice had this soft, intimate quality that I recognized because it was the same tone he used when he whispered in my ear during those lazy Sunday mornings we'd spent planning our future. Only now he was using it with her. I couldn't make out the exact words from where I stood, but I didn't need to. The tone told me everything. It was the sound of a man talking to someone he loved, someone he was trying to impress, someone he wanted to keep happy, someone who definitely wasn't his girlfriend of 2 years. My hands started shaking first. It's funny how your body knows what's happening before your brain catches up, like some primitive alarm system that starts screaming danger while you're still trying to convince yourself that everything's fine. The keys slipped from my fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the entire apartment. The voices stopped. I should have run. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around, walk out that door, and pretend I'd never been there. But I couldn't move. It was like my feet had suddenly forgotten how to work, and all I could do was stand there listening to the sound of footsteps approaching. Marcus appeared in the hallway first, and the expression on his face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 2 seconds. Surprise, guilt, panic, anger, and then something that looked almost like relief. That relief was what killed me, not the guilt. I could have worked with guilt. Guilt meant he knew he'd done something wrong, meant there was still some part of him that cared about what this would do to me. But relief? Relief meant he'd been waiting for this moment, hoping for an excuse to end things without having to be the bad guy. Relief meant I'd been nothing more than a placeholder. Stephanie appeared behind him a moment later, and she had the decency to look ashamed, at least. Her perfect blonde hair was messed up in a way that suggested she'd been doing exactly what I thought she'd been doing, and she was wearing one of Marcus's t-shirts, the gray one with the hole near the bottom hem that I'd been trying to get him to throw away for months. Seeing her in his shirt was somehow worse than finding them together. It was so casual, so domestic, like she belonged there in a way that I apparently never had. The 3 of us stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably only a few seconds. Nobody saying anything because what the hell do you say in a situation like that? Then Marcus cleared his throat and crossed his arms over his chest, and I watched him transform from the guy who'd been planning our weekend getaway just 3 days earlier into someone I'd never seen before. Cold, defensive, almost annoyed that I'd interrupted his little secret. He told me that this had been going on for 2 months. 2 months. While I was picking out paint colors for the apartment we were supposedly going to share, while I was deflecting my mother's questions about when he was going to propose, while I was turning down dates with other guys because I was committed to building something real with him. 2 fucking months. Stephanie tried to say something. I could see her mouth moving, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The apartment suddenly felt too small, too hot, like the walls were closing in and I couldn't get enough air. That's when Marcus dropped the real bomb. They weren't just fooling around. They weren't just having some casual affair that would burn out once the novelty wore off. They were in love. They were planning to move in together. They were talking about getting married. I must have made some kind of sound because Marcus took a step toward me, and that's when his expression shifted again. The cold defensiveness melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like pity, and that was when I knew I was about to get the speech that would haunt me for the next 3 months. He said I was a good person. He said I deserved better. He said this wasn't about anything I'd done wrong. It was about what he and Stephanie had together being something special, something he'd never experienced before. He said a lot of things, actually, but the only words that really penetrated the fog of shock and humiliation were the ones he spat out when I finally found my voice and asked him how he could do this to me. That's when his face twisted with irritation, like I was being unreasonable for being upset about finding my boyfriend and my cousin together in what was clearly a well-established relationship. That's when he looked me straight in the eye and shouted those words that would become the soundtrack to everything that happened next. "I never want to see you again." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I actually stumbled backward. He said it with such venom, such conviction, like the sight of me was genuinely offensive to him, like I was the problem here. I left without saying another word. I walked out of that apartment, got in my car, and drove home in complete silence because I couldn't trust myself to speak without falling apart completely. I made it as far as my driveway before the tears started, and once they started, I couldn't stop them. I cried for the 2 years I'd wasted. I cried for the future I'd been planning that would never happen. I cried for the humiliation of being replaced by my own cousin, and for the realization that everyone at family gatherings was going to know exactly why Marcus and I broke up. But mostly, I cried because I finally understood that the man I'd been in love with had never actually existed. The Marcus who brought me coffee in bed, who listened to my work drama and offered advice, who made plans for our future, that guy was just a character he'd been playing until something better came along. And something better had definitely come along. The next few days were a blur of calling in sick to work, eating ice cream for breakfast, and screening calls from well-meaning friends who'd heard through the grapevine that Marcus and I had broken up but didn't know the full story yet. I wasn't ready to tell anyone what had really happened because saying it out loud would make it real, and I wasn't quite ready for it to be real yet. But reality has a way of forcing itself on you whether you're ready or not. A week later, my mom called to tell me that Stephanie had some exciting news to share at Sunday dinner. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly what that exciting news was going to be, but I told myself maybe I was wrong. Maybe Stephanie had gotten a promotion, or won the lottery, or decided to move to another country. Sunday dinner was torture. I sat there picking at my mashed potatoes while Stephanie glowed and giggled and talked about how she'd met someone special. She was being coy about the details, but she kept making these little comments about how funny life was, how love could surprise you when you least expected it. My aunt kept asking questions, and my mom was getting more and more excited, and I just sat there feeling like I was watching a car accident in slow motion. I knew what was coming, but I couldn't look away, and I couldn't make myself leave. Then Stephanie dropped the bomb. She was dating Marcus. My Marcus? Well, not mine anymore, obviously, but she said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like there was nothing strange about dating your cousin's ex-boyfriend of 2 years. The room went dead silent. My mom's fork froze halfway to her mouth. My aunt looked confused, like she was trying to do math in her head. My dad cleared his throat in that way he does when he's trying not to get involved in drama, but knows he's about to get dragged into it anyway. And Stephanie just kept smiling, looking around the table like she expected everyone to burst into applause. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable, and then my mom finally spoke up and asked how long this had been going on. Stephanie got a little shifty then, mumbling something about it being recent, but I could see her calculating in her head, trying to figure out how much truth she could get away with. That's when I realized she hadn't told them about the timeline. She was going to let everyone think this had happened after Marcus and I broke up. Not that it was the reason we broke up. I should have spoken up. I should have told everyone exactly what had happened and when. But I couldn't make myself do it because that would mean admitting that I'd been replaced, that I'd been so easy to discard that my own cousin had managed to steal my boyfriend without me even noticing. So I just sat there and smiled and congratulated her and pretended like my heart wasn't being fed through a wood chipper. The dinner ended with everyone being awkwardly polite and me promising to get together with Stephanie soon so we could talk about everything. I knew that conversation was never going to happen because what was there to talk about? She'd won, just like she always did. I was halfway home when my phone buzzed with a text from Stephanie. She wanted to meet for coffee to clear the air and make sure there were no hard feelings between us. No hard feelings. Like she'd accidentally borrowed my sweater without asking, not stolen my entire future. I stared at that text for about 10 minutes, trying to figure out how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore her completely, but a bigger part of me was curious about what she could possibly have to say for herself. Did she really think we were going to sit down and have a nice chat about how she'd betrayed me? Did she expect me to wish her luck and offer to be in her wedding? Because yeah, there was going to be a wedding. She made sure to mention that in her text. They were moving fast, she said, because when you know, you know. I never responded to that text. Instead, I spent the next week in a weird emotional limbo, somewhere between fury and numbness. I kept waiting for the anger to hit, for that righteous indignation that would fuel me to do something dramatic like key his car or send screenshots of their relationship timeline to everyone we knew. But the anger never came. Not the hot, immediate kind anyway. What came instead was something colder, more calculated. It started as a tiny seed of resentment that grew every time I thought about Marcus's face when he'd told me he never wanted to see me again. It grew when I remembered Stephanie's casual cruelty in wearing his shirt. It grew when I realized that they were probably laughing about me, probably sharing inside jokes about how clueless I'd been. And it really started growing when I got the invitation. Yes, you read that right? I got a fucking wedding invitation. It showed up in my mailbox 3 weeks after the Sunday dinner incident, tucked between a credit card offer and a grocery store circular like it was just another piece of junk mail. Thick, expensive cardstock with elegant script that probably cost more than my rent. Marcus David Thompson and Stephanie Marie Rodriguez request the pleasure of your company as they unite in marriage. I read that line about 5 times before it sank in. They had invited me to their wedding. My ex-boyfriend and my cousin had invited me to watch them get married. The audacity was breathtaking. I actually laughed out loud when I saw my name written in careful calligraphy on the inner envelope, because what kind of special level of delusion did it take to think I would want to attend their wedding? But then I kept reading and I saw the date, August 15th, our anniversary, mine and Marcus's. They were getting married on what would have been our 3rd anniversary. That's when the anger finally hit. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger I'd been expecting. It was something much worse. Cold, methodical rage that settled in my chest like a block of ice and started spreading through my entire body. I set the invitation down on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time, my mind cycling through about a dozen different emotions before landing on something that felt almost like clarity. August 15th. Of all the dates in the entire fucking calendar, they'd chosen ours. That wasn't an accident. There was no way in hell that was an accident. Marcus knew exactly what that date meant. I'd been the one to suggest we celebrate our 2-year anniversary a month early because he was going to be out of town for work on the actual day. I'd made dinner reservations, bought a new dress, spent way too much money on a watch I thought he'd love. We'd talked about how special that day was, how it marked the beginning of something real between us. And now he was marrying my cousin on that exact same date. The invitation felt heavy in my hands, like it was made of lead instead of paper. I kept reading it over and over, looking for some sign that this was all an elaborate joke, that someone was going to jump out and tell me I was being punked. But no, there it was in black and white. Ceremony at 4 p.m. at St. Mark's Cathedral. Reception to follow at the Grandview Country Club. The same country club where my family had celebrated every major milestone for the past 15 years, where I'd gotten my graduation party, where my parents had their anniversary dinner every year, where I'd probably been planning to have my own wedding reception someday. They were taking everything. Not just Marcus, not just the future I'd been planning, but even the places that belonged to my family. My history. I sat down at my kitchen table and really looked at the invitation for the first time, studying every detail like I was preparing for a test. The paper quality, the font choices, the little decorative flourishes around the edges, everything about it screamed expensive and tasteful and perfect, just like Stephanie. Just like the life she'd always been able to create for herself without any effort at all. That's when I started thinking about the guest list. Who else had gotten one of these invitations? Did Marcus's family know the real timeline? Did they know he'd been cheating on me with my cousin? Or did they think this was some whirlwind romance that had started after we broke up? Did my extended family know? Or were they all just as clueless as my parents had been at that Sunday dinner? I realized I didn't actually care what other people knew or thought. What I cared about was the fact that Marcus and Stephanie were getting away with this completely. They'd rewritten history to make themselves the victims of an unfortunate situation instead of the cheating assholes they actually were. They were going to have their perfect wedding, their perfect life, and I was supposed to what? Just disappear? Pretend like none of it had ever happened? Fuck that. I spent that entire night pacing around my apartment, turning the invitation over in my hands and trying to figure out what I was feeling. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was something deeper, more complicated. I felt erased. Like the 2 years I'd spent with Marcus had been nothing more than a footnote in his real love story. Like I was so forgettable, so easily replaceable, that my own cousin had been able to step into my life without missing a beat. But there was something else too. Something that had been bothering me since that night I'd found them together. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on until I was standing in my kitchen at 3 a.m. staring at their wedding invitation. Marcus had told me he never wanted to see me again. But they'd invited me to their wedding. Think about that for a second. You tell someone you never want to see them again, and then 3 months later you send them an invitation to the most important day of your life? That doesn't make sense unless you're either completely delusional or you're trying to prove a point. And Marcus wasn't delusional. Arrogant, yes. Selfish, absolutely. But not delusional, which meant they were trying to prove a point. They wanted me there. They wanted me to see them happy together, wanted me to watch them get everything I'd thought was going to be mine. They wanted me to sit in that church and smile and clap and pretend to be happy for them while they exchanged vows on our anniversary. They wanted to complete my humiliation in front of everyone we knew. Well, if they wanted me there so badly, who was I to disappoint them? I started planning that night. Not the dramatic movie-style revenge that involves crashing through the doors and objecting during the ceremony, though I'll admit that fantasy kept me entertained for a while. I started planning something much more subtle, much more devastating. Because here's the thing about Marcus and Stephanie that everyone always seemed to miss. They were both incredibly image-conscious. Everything in their lives had to look perfect, had to fit the narrative they'd created about themselves. Marcus had spent our entire relationship talking about his brand and how important it was to maintain a certain reputation in his industry. Stephanie had built her entire identity around being the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the princess who deserved everything good that happened to her. They'd invited me to their wedding because they were so confident in their own perfection that they thought I'd just sit there and take it. They thought I was beaten, broken, too pathetic to do anything but accept my role as the discarded ex-girlfriend who'd graciously stepped aside for true love. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I took the next day off work and spent it doing research. I drove by the church, timed the route from the ceremony to the reception, looked up the catering company and the florist and the photographer. I wanted to understand every detail of their perfect day so I could figure out exactly where and how to make it not so perfect. The more I learned, the more I realized how much thought they'd put into crafting this wedding. Every vendor was top tier, every detail was designed to impress. The flowers alone probably cost more than most people's cars. They were pulling out all the stops, sparing no expense to make sure everyone knew how successful and happy they were. That's when I remembered something Marcus had told me during one of our conversations about the future. He'd said that when he got married, it would be the event of the year. Everyone would be talking about it for months afterward. He wanted a wedding that people would remember forever. Well, he was going to get exactly what he wanted, just not in the way he was expecting. I started making lists, guest lists, vendor lists, timeline lists. I called the country club and pretended to be planning my own wedding just to get information about their policies and procedures. I drove through the neighborhood where the reception was being held to scout parking and exits. I even created a fake social media account to follow some of the guests I knew would be posting about the wedding in real time. The more I planned, the clearer my head became. For the first time since I'd found them together, I felt like I was in control of something. I wasn't just sitting around feeling sorry for myself anymore. I was taking action. I was going to make sure that Marcus got exactly what he'd asked for when he told me he never wanted to see me again. But first, I had to figure out what I actually wanted to accomplish. Did I want to ruin their wedding completely? Did I want to embarrass them in front of their guests? Did I want to expose the truth about how their relationship had started? The answer came to me while I was sitting in my car outside the country club, watching the event staff set up for someone else's reception. I didn't want to destroy their wedding. That would just make me look like the crazy ex-girlfriend, and they'd get sympathy from everyone. I didn't want to cause a huge scene that would overshadow their day, that would just give them a story to tell for years about how I'd lost my mind and tried to ruin their happiness. What I wanted was much simpler and much more brutal. I wanted them to remember me every time they looked at their wedding photos. I wanted their perfect day to have one imperfect moment that would stick with them forever. I wanted to take back some small piece of what they'd stolen from me, and I wanted to do it in a way that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves. I wanted to show up looking absolutely fucking stunning and remind Marcus exactly what he'd thrown away. But it had to be more than that. Looking good wasn't enough. Any ex-girlfriend could show up to a wedding looking hot and call it revenge. I needed something that would get under their skin and stay there, something that would make them realize they'd underestimated me completely. That's when I remembered the conversation I'd had with Stephanie's mom at Christmas last year. She'd been going on and about how proud she was of Stephanie's success, how Stephanie had always been such a high achiever, how she was going to do such great things with her life. And then she'd made this comment about how it was too bad I hadn't been able to find the same kind of success, how maybe someday I'd figure out what I wanted to do with my life. At the time, I'd brushed it off because I was used to being compared to Stephanie and coming up short. But now I realized that my aunt, and probably a lot of other people in my family, saw me as the underachiever, the one who was just coasting through life without any real ambition or direction. They saw Stephanie as the prize and me as the consolation. Well, it was time to change that narrative. I'd been working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized company for the past 3 years, and I was good at my job, but I'd never really pushed for advancement because I'd been focused on my relationship with Marcus. I'd turned down opportunities to travel for work, passed up networking events, avoided taking on high-profile projects because I wanted to be available for date nights and weekend trips and all the other relationship maintenance that had apparently been a complete waste of time. But now I had nothing but time and motivation. Over the next 2 months, I threw myself into my career with the kind of intensity I'd previously reserved for planning anniversaries and birthday surprises. I volunteered for every project, stayed late every night, pitched ideas I'd been sitting on for years because I was too afraid of failure to pursue them. And it worked. My boss noticed. The clients noticed. Within 6 weeks, I'd been promoted to senior marketing manager with a salary increase that would have made my past self weep with joy. More importantly, I'd landed the company's biggest client, a luxury hotel chain that was expanding into our market and needed a complete rebranding campaign. The project was huge, the kind of thing that could make a career, and they'd specifically requested me to lead it based on a presentation I'd given that apparently impressed the hell out of their CEO. It was the kind of professional success I'd been dreaming about for years without ever really believing it was possible. But the best part? The absolute best part was that the campaign launch was scheduled for the week after Marcus and Stephanie's wedding. I'd be flying to New York for meetings with the client's executive team, staying at hotels I could never have afforded before, presenting to rooms full of people who had no idea I was supposed to be the sad, pathetic ex-girlfriend pining away for a man who'd replaced me with my cousin. I was going to walk into that wedding as a completely different person than the one who'd been discarded 3 months earlier. Not just because of the promotion, though, that was a nice touch, but because I'd finally figured out who I was when I wasn't defining myself by my relationship to someone else. The week before the wedding, I went shopping, not just for a dress, though I did find the perfect one, black, because I've always looked incredible in black, with a cut that managed to be both elegant and subtly devastating. I got my hair done, treated myself to professional makeup, bought shoes that cost more than I'd ever spent on shoes in my life, but were absolutely worth it for the confidence boost alone. I also bought a wedding gift. Something that had taken me weeks to track down, something that would mean absolutely nothing to anyone else at that wedding, but would mean everything to Marcus. A first edition of the book he'd been reading the night we met, the one he'd been going on and about because it was out of print and impossible to find. I'd spent months hunting for a copy for his birthday last year, but hadn't been able to afford the prices I was seeing online. Now I could afford it. Now I could wrap it in beautiful paper with a card that said, "Congratulations on finding everything you've been looking for," and sign it with my name like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because that's what this was really about. Not proving that I was better than Stephanie, not trying to win Marcus back, not even trying to ruin their day. It was about proving to myself that I could walk into the space where I'd been humiliated and hold my head high. It was about taking back my own narrative instead of letting them write it for me. The night before the wedding, I laid everything out on my bed like I was preparing for battle. The dress, the shoes, the jewelry I'd borrowed from my mom because it was expensive enough to make a statement, the wedding gift, wrapped and ready, the new business cards I'd had printed with my new title, just in case anyone asked what I'd been up to lately. I looked at all of it spread out there and realized that somewhere in the past 3 months, I'd stopped being the woman who cried in her driveway after finding her boyfriend with another woman. I'd become someone else entirely. Someone who could afford expensive shoes and luxury hotels. Someone who had landed the biggest client in her company's history. Someone who could walk into any room and belong there. Marcus had said he never wanted to see me again, but he was about to get a front row seat to exactly who I'd become in his absence. And if that sight made him question every choice he'd made since that night in his apartment, well, that was just a bonus. I went to bed early that night because I wanted to be well rested for what was going to be a very interesting day. As I was falling asleep, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 months ago, desperate for his approval, willing to shrink herself to fit into his vision of what a girlfriend should be, so afraid of being alone that she'd ignored every red flag he'd thrown up. That woman was gone. Tomorrow, I was going to bury her completely. I woke up that Saturday morning feeling like I was about to perform the most important role of my life. Not the heartbroken ex-girlfriend, not the discarded woman, not the cousin who got stepped on. Today I was going to be exactly who I'd become over the past 3 months, successful, confident, and completely unbothered by their little performance. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending more time getting ready for their wedding than I'd spent getting ready for most of my actual dates with Marcus. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was about me walking into that room and owning every second of it. I started with a long shower, taking my time because I had nowhere else I needed to be. No one was waiting for me. No one was depending on me to be anywhere at any particular time. For the first time in months, that felt like freedom instead of loneliness. The dress fit even better than it had in the store. Black silk that moved like water, cut to show just enough skin to make a statement without looking like I was trying too hard. It was the kind of dress that whispered instead of shouted, the kind that made people lean in closer to figure out what they were missing. I'd learned something about power dressing during my career acceleration. Sometimes the most devastating outfits are the ones that look effortless. My hair fell in perfect waves that had taken an hour and a half to achieve, but looked like I'd just rolled out of bed looking gorgeous. My makeup was flawless but subtle, the kind of look that suggested I was naturally this beautiful all the time. And the shoes, God, the shoes were perfect. 3-inch heels that made my legs look like they went on forever, expensive enough that you could tell just by looking at them, but classic enough that no one could accuse me of being inappropriate. I looked in the mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. Not because I looked different exactly, but because I looked like myself for the first time in years. Not like Marcus's girlfriend, not like Stephanie's cousin, not like anyone's anything. Just me, but the best possible version of me. The drive to the church gave me time to run through my plan one more time. I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to object during the ceremony or cause any kind of dramatic disruption. I was simply going to show up, be gracious and lovely, and let my presence speak for itself. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is just existing beautifully in the space where someone hoped you'd disappear. Saint? Mark's cathedral was every bit as elegant as I'd expected. Stephanie had always had expensive taste, and apparently Marcus's family had the money to indulge it. Cars lined the street, BMWs, Mercedes, a few Teslas for the environmentally conscious wealthy crowd. I parked my own car, which suddenly looked very modest in comparison, and reminded myself that I belonged here just as much as anyone else. The church was already filling up when I arrived, which was perfect. I wanted people to see me walk in, wanted there to be just enough of a stir to make Marcus and Stephanie aware of my presence without creating actual drama. I signed the guest book with my full name and new title, noting that my handwriting looked confident and elegant next to some of the scrawled signatures above it. I could feel eyes on me as I walked down the aisle looking for a seat. Not because people recognized me, most of these guests were from Marcus's side and had no idea who I was, but because when you walk into a room looking like you own it, people notice. I found a spot about halfway back, close enough to see everything but far enough away that I wouldn't be in any of the official photos. That's when I saw him for the first time in 3 months. Marcus was standing at the altar with his groomsmen, looking exactly like the successful, handsome man I'd fallen in love with. His hair was perfectly styled, his tuxedo was clearly expensive, and he had that confident smile that had attracted me to him in the first place. For a split second, I felt a tiny pang of something. Not longing, exactly, but maybe nostalgia for the version of him I'd thought I was dating. Then he turned slightly and his eyes found mine in the crowd. I watched his face go through the same progression of emotions I'd seen that night in his apartment, but this time I was ready for it. This time I wasn't the shaking, devastated woman who'd dropped her keys in the hallway. This time I was the woman who'd rebuilt her entire life in 3 months and was sitting in his wedding looking like a fucking goddess. His mouth actually fell open a little bit. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but I caught it because I was watching for exactly that reaction. Then he seemed to remember where he was and what he was supposed to be doing, and his expression shifted into something that looked almost like panic. Good. I gave him a small smile, not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledging, and then turned my attention to the program like I hadn't just watched him realize that maybe he'd made a huge mistake. The processional started a few minutes later, and I watched Marcus's family and friends walk down the aisle. His mother looked exactly like I remembered, elegant, perfectly put together, the kind of woman who probably had opinions about everyone's life choices. His sister caught my eye and gave me a little wave, which was sweet. She'd always been nice to me, and I'd wondered if she knew the real story about how things had ended. Then the music changed and everyone stood for the bride. Stephanie looked stunning, of course. She always did. The dress was everything you'd expect. Designer, probably cost more than my car, fit her like it had been sewn directly onto her body. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. Her smile was radiant with the kind of joy that only comes from getting everything you've ever wanted. But here's the thing about beauty. It's not actually that rare. What's rare is presence, confidence, the ability to command a room without trying. And as I watched Stephanie float down that aisle looking like a fairy tale princess, I realized that for all her physical perfection, she looked small, young, like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Maybe it was just my perspective, or maybe it was the fact that I knew exactly how she'd gotten here, but there was something fragile about her happiness. Like she was holding it too tightly, afraid it might disappear if she relaxed for even a second. The ceremony itself was beautiful and completely traditional. Marcus looked appropriately emotional during the vows, though I noticed his eyes kept drifting to where I was sitting. Stephanie cried at all the right moments, laughed at all the right moments, looked absolutely perfect in every single photo the photographer was taking. I sat through the entire thing with a serene smile on my face, occasionally nodding or looking touched by particularly sweet moments, playing the role of the gracious ex who was genuinely happy for them. Because that's what this was, a performance. And I was going to give the performance of my fucking life. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," I clapped along with everyone else. When they walked back up the aisle as husband and wife, I smiled and nodded as they passed my row. Stephanie's eyes met mine for just a second, and I saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or uncertainty. She hadn't expected me to actually show up, and she definitely hadn't expected me to show up looking like this. The receiving line after the ceremony was where things got interesting. I waited until most of the crowd had moved through before joining the line, timing it so I wouldn't hold up the flow, but would have a moment to make an impression. When it was my turn, I approached Marcus first. "Congratulations." I said, extending my hand like we were business acquaintances meeting for the first time. You look very happy. He took my hand automatically, and I felt him squeeze it just a little too tightly, hold it just a little too long. Up close, I could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he was trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the one he'd shouted at 3 months ago. Thank you for coming, he said, and his voice was carefully neutral. You look really good. Thank you. I feel really good. I smiled at him like we were sharing a pleasant but meaningless exchange, then moved on to Stephanie before he could say anything else. Stephanie, you look absolutely beautiful, I said, and I meant it. She did look beautiful. She also looked like she'd seen a ghost. Thank you, she stammered, clearly thrown off by my presence. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. Oh, I wouldn't miss it, I said brightly. Family is so important, don't you think? And besides, I had some exciting news to share. I could see her trying to figure out what I meant by that, but before she could ask, I was moving on to congratulate Marcus's parents and the rest of the wedding party. The entire exchange had taken maybe 2 minutes, but I could feel both of them watching me as I walked away. The cocktail hour before the reception was where I really got to work. I circulated through the crowd like I was hosting my own party, making conversation with people I knew and introducing myself to people I didn't. I talked about my promotion, my new client, the trip to New York I'd be taking next week. I mentioned casually that I was thinking about buying a condo, that I was considering adopting a dog now that my schedule was more flexible, that I was really excited about this new chapter in my life. Every conversation was perfectly pleasant, perfectly normal, and perfectly calculated to get back to Marcus and Stephanie that I wasn't just doing well, I was thriving. Marcus's sister found me during cocktail hour, and we ended up having a long conversation about our careers. She was a lawyer, ambitious and smart, and she seemed genuinely impressed when I told her about landing the hotel chain account. You know, she said at one point, Marcus mentioned you were in marketing, but he never said you were this successful. He made it sound like you were just, working some entry-level job. Interesting. So he'd been downplaying my career even while we were together. Filing that information away for later. Well, a lot can change in a few months, I said with a smile. Sometimes you don't realize what you're capable of until you have the right motivation. I also ran into several of my cousins and aunts and uncles, all of whom seemed surprised to see me there. My presence had clearly caused some whispered conversations. I could see people glancing in my direction and talking in low voices. But the overall reaction seemed to be curiosity rather than judgment, which told me that most of the family still didn't know the real timeline of Marcus and Stephanie's relationship. That was about to change. I'd been carrying the wedding gift with me all evening, waiting for the right moment. During dinner, while everyone was focused on their plates and the speeches hadn't started yet, I made my move. I approached their sweetheart table with the gift in hand, smiling like I'd just remembered something important. I almost forgot, I said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. I brought you something special. Marcus and Stephanie both looked up from their dinner, and I could see the wariness in their eyes. They had no idea what I might be planning, which was exactly where I wanted them. You really didn't need to, Stephanie started, but I was already placing the beautifully wrapped package on their table. Oh, but I wanted to, I said. It's something I know Marcus has been wanting for a very long time. I actually tried to get it for him last year for his birthday, but I couldn't afford it then. I watched Marcus's face as he processed what I'd said. Last year, when we were still together, when I was supposedly just his casual girlfriend who didn't understand him well enough to pick out meaningful gifts. Should I open it now? He asked, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Of course. I'd love to see your reaction. He unwrapped it carefully, probably hoping it was something innocuous that wouldn't cause any awkward questions. When he saw what it was, his face went completely white. It was the first edition I'd mentioned, but it wasn't just any copy. I'd specifically hunted down the exact same edition he'd been reading the night we met, complete with the same cover art and the same publisher. And I'd had it inscribed, "To Marcus." I'd written in careful script on the inside cover, "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the things we think we want aren't actually worth having. I hope this reminds you of all the stories that shaped who you became. With gratitude for the life lessons, your past." He stared at the inscription for a long time, long enough that people at the nearby tables started to notice something was happening. Stephanie leaned over to read it, and I watched her face change as she realized what she was looking at. "That's so thoughtful," she said finally, but her voice sounded strained. How did you know he wanted this? Oh, we talked about it all the time, I said casually. Marcus has always been passionate about rare books. He spent hours telling me about this particular edition, about how it was published the same year his grandfather died, and how finding a copy would feel like getting a piece of family history back. None of that was true, of course. Marcus had mentioned the book exactly once in passing on our first date. But Stephanie didn't know that, and judging by the look on her face, Marcus had never shared any of those kinds of intimate details with her. He's never mentioned... She started, then caught herself. Oh, well, you know how men are about sentimental things, I said with a laugh. They don't always share those deeper emotions right away. I'm sure he'll open up more about his family history as you get to know each other better. The implication hung in the air like a bomb. As you get to know each other better. Like they were still in the early stages of their relationship, still discovering things about each other. Like maybe their whirlwind romance hadn't given them time to really understand who they were marrying. Marcus finally found his voice. This is incredible. You really didn't need to do this. I wanted to, I said simply. Besides, I know how much you value the things that connect us to our past. And speaking of the past, I should probably mention, I'm not sure if everyone knows the whole story about how you two got together. Both of them froze. This was the moment I'd been building toward all evening, the moment when I got to decide whether to destroy them completely or just leave them with the knowledge that I could have. I continued, my voice still perfectly pleasant. It's such a romantic story. Love at first sight, right? Sometimes when you meet the right person, you just know, and you can't help following your heart even when the timing is complicated. I paused, letting them think I was about to expose everything. I could see Marcus calculating damage control in his head, could see Stephanie trying to figure out how to explain away a timeline that would make them both look terrible. Anyway, I said, smile never wavering, I just wanted to say congratulations again. You're so lucky to have found each other. And then I walked away, leaving them to wonder what the hell had just happened and whether I was planning to say anything else. The rest of the reception was a masterclass in subtle psychological warfare. I danced with several of Marcus's groomsmen, all of whom seemed charmed by my conversation and completely unaware that I was supposed to be the bitter ex-girlfriend. I gave a warm hello to Marcus's parents and talked about how proud they must be. I complimented the flowers, the music, the food, everything that Stephanie had probably spent months planning. Every interaction was perfect, gracious, exactly what you'd expect from a mature woman who'd moved on from her past relationship and was genuinely happy for her cousin's new marriage. But Marcus and Stephanie knew better. They could see the calculation behind every smile, could feel the threat in every compliment. Because here's what I'd figured out. I didn't need to destroy their wedding to get my revenge. I just needed to plant the seeds of doubt that would grow long after the party was over. The book had accomplished the first part, reminding Marcus of the connection we'd had, the intimacy that maybe he'd forgotten about or convinced himself hadn't been real. The inscription made it clear that I understood exactly what had happened and how, but that I was choosing not to destroy them with that knowledge. The comments about getting to know each other better had planted doubt about whether they really knew each other as well as they thought they did. Stephanie was going to go home and wonder what other stories Marcus had shared with me that he'd never told her. She was going to question whether their connection was as deep as she'd believed, and Marcus was going to look at me all evening and realize that the woman he'd discarded so casually had become someone he couldn't afford to lose. Every time I laughed with someone else, every time I mentioned my promotion or my new client or my bright future, he was going to remember that he'd had this woman and had thrown her away for someone else. But the real masterstroke came during the bouquet toss. Stephanie called all the single women to the dance floor, and normally I would have found an excuse to avoid participating. But tonight I joined the crowd, positioning myself right in the front where everyone could see me. When Stephanie turned around and threw the bouquet, I made no effort to catch it. I just stood there with my hands at my sides, smiling serenely, while chaos erupted around me as other women jumped and reached for the flowers. The bouquet landed right at my feet. I looked down at it for a moment, then looked up at Stephanie with an expression that I hoped conveyed polite surprise. I picked it up slowly, held it for just a moment longer than necessary, then walked over and handed it to the woman who'd been reaching for it when it sailed over her head. "I think this belongs to you," I said graciously. "I'm not really in the market for marriage right now. Too much happening with my career." The crowd laughed and applauded my graciousness, but I could see Marcus and Stephanie watching me with something that looked like horror, because they understood what that gesture meant. I was so unbothered by their marriage, so focused on my own success, that I couldn't even be bothered to participate in the fantasy of finding love again. I wasn't the heartbroken ex-girlfriend pining for what they had. I was the woman who'd moved so far beyond them that their happiness was irrelevant to my life. The evening was winding down when Marcus finally cornered me near the coat check. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Do we?" I asked, tilting my head like I was genuinely curious about what he could possibly want to discuss. You look incredible. And this promotion, this new job." "Oh, that's sweet of you to say. Thank you. I had no idea you were capable of—" He stopped himself before he could finish that sentence, but we both knew what he'd been about to say. He'd had no idea I was capable of being successful without him. No idea I was capable of becoming someone impressive on my own. "Capable of what?" I asked innocently. I never saw this side of you before." "Maybe because you never looked." The words hung between us for a moment, and I could see him processing them. Processing the implication that maybe, just maybe, he'd never really known me at all. That maybe the woman he'd been so eager to discard had been hiding someone remarkable that he'd been too self-absorbed to notice. "I should go," I said, checking my watch. "Early flight tomorrow." "Work calls, you know." "Right. Of course. The New York thing." "Yes, the New York thing." I smiled at him like he was a distant acquaintance whose name I was trying to remember. "Congratulations again, Marcus. I hope you get everything you deserve." I walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing there with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. As I drove home that night, I thought about the woman who'd cried in her driveway 3 months ago. She'd thought her life was ending because a man had decided she wasn't worth keeping. She'd believed that being chosen by someone else was the only way to prove her own value. That woman was gone completely now, replaced by someone who understood that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. It's becoming so fucking magnificent that your absence becomes the other person's loss, not yours. Marcus had told me he never wanted to see me again, and tonight I'd given him exactly what he'd asked for. He'd seen me, but he'd never have me again. He'd spent his wedding night watching the woman he'd thrown away become someone he could never reach, someone who was already moving in circles he'd never be invited to join. And the beautiful thing was, it wasn't even about him anymore. The success, the confidence, the life I was building, none of it was designed to make him jealous or win him back. It was just me, finally becoming who I was supposed to be when I wasn't trying to shrink myself to fit into someone else's limited vision of what I could be. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was already thinking about my flight the next morning, about the meetings waiting for me in New York, about the life I was going to build that had nothing to do with Marcus or Stephanie or any of the people who'd underestimated me. I never wanted to see him again either, as it turned out. And after tonight, I was pretty sure I wouldn't have to. 6 months later, I was sitting in a corner office in Manhattan, looking out at a view that would have seemed impossible to the woman who'd found her boyfriend cheating with her cousin. The hotel chain project had been even more successful than anyone had anticipated, and they'd offered me a position as their director of brand strategy with a salary that made my old life look like I'd been playing with toy money. I'd moved to New York 3 months after the wedding, not because I was running away from anything, but because I was running towards something bigger than I'd ever imagined possible. The city suited me in a way that my old life never had. Fast-paced, demanding, full of people who cared more about what you could accomplish than where you came from or who you used to date. I hardly thought about Marcus and Stephanie anymore, which was perhaps the most satisfying part of the whole thing. They'd become footnotes in my story instead of the main characters, relegated to the chapter titled, "Things That Happened Before My Real Life Began." But every once in a while, something would remind me of that night at their wedding, and I'd smile to myself at how perfectly everything had worked out. Like the day I got the friend request on social media from Marcus's sister. We'd stayed in touch sporadically since the wedding, and she'd reached out to congratulate me on a business article that had featured my work with the hotel chain. She'd mentioned in passing that Marcus had asked about me recently, wondered how I was doing, whether I was seeing anyone. The fact that he was still thinking about me, still wondering about my life, was more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Because it meant that my presence at his wedding had accomplished exactly what I'd intended. It had planted a seed of doubt that had grown into something he couldn't ignore. According to his sister, things between Marcus and Stephanie weren't quite as perfect as their Instagram feeds suggested. Not that they were having problems exactly, but there was something different about Marcus since the wedding. He'd become more distant, more focused on work, less satisfied with the life they'd built together. He kept talking about missed opportunities, about wondering what would have happened if he'd made different choices. I didn't take any particular pleasure in hearing that their marriage wasn't the fairy tale they'd expected. Well, maybe a little pleasure, but mostly I felt nothing. Their relationship had become someone else's problem, someone else's story. I had my own story now, and it was so much better than anything I could have imagined when I was crying in my driveway 6 months ago. The real validation came from an unexpected source, my cousin Stephanie herself. She'd called me about a month after I moved to New York, ostensibly to congratulate me on the new job, but really to fish for information about my life. The conversation was awkward and stilted, full of long pauses and careful words, like we were both trying to navigate around landmines. She mentioned that Marcus had been different since the wedding, that he seemed preoccupied with something she couldn't identify. She asked, very casually, whether I was happy in New York, whether I missed home, whether I ever thought about the past. There was something desperate in her voice, like she was trying to figure out whether I was a threat to the life she'd built on the foundation of my discarded relationship. I told her the truth, that I was happier than I'd ever been, that New York felt like home in a way that nowhere else ever had, that I rarely thought about the past because the future was so much more interesting. I could hear her trying to process this information, trying to figure out whether I was lying or whether I really had moved on so completely. The conversation ended with her saying that she was glad I was doing well, that she'd always known I had potential, that she hoped we could rebuild our relationship now that everything had settled down. I was polite but non-committal, because the truth was that I had no interest in rebuilding anything with her. She'd shown me who she was when she thought she could get away with it, and I'd learned that some bridges are better left burned. But the conversation did clarify something important for me. Stephanie was still thinking about me, still worried about my place in their story, which meant that my appearance at their wedding had accomplished something even more satisfying than I'd planned. It had made her question whether she'd really won anything at all. Because here's what I'd figured out in the months since that night. There's no such thing as winning someone away from someone else. Marcus hadn't chosen Stephanie because she was better than me. He'd chosen her because she was easier. She didn't challenge him, didn't have her own ambitions that might conflict with his, didn't require him to grow or change or become a better version of himself. She was the path of least resistance, the choice that allowed him to stay exactly who he'd always been. And maybe that's what they both needed. Maybe they deserved each other in the most literal sense. Maybe I should have been grateful that they'd saved me from a life of settling for someone who couldn't see my potential, who couldn't imagine me as anything more than a supporting character in his own story. The revenge I'd thought I wanted at their wedding had evolved into something much more profound. The understanding that being discarded by Marcus wasn't a failure on my part, it was a gift. It had forced me to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone else's ideal girlfriend, and that person turned out to be pretty fucking incredible. I thought about this a lot during those first few months in New York, especially when I was working late in my new office or attending industry events where people introduced me as the woman who landed the Morrison account, instead of Marcus's ex-girlfriend or Stephanie's cousin. I'd become someone whose accomplishments stood on their own, whose story didn't require explaining my relationship to other people. The best part was that none of it felt like revenge anymore. It just felt like my life, the life I was supposed to have been living all along, if I hadn't been so busy trying to fit myself into someone else's vision of who I should be. The success, the confidence, the sense of purpose, it was all real. All mine, all built on a foundation that had nothing to do with Marcus or Stephanie or anyone else who'd underestimated me. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd handled things differently. If I'd made a scene at the wedding, or exposed their timeline publicly, or tried to win Marcus back through some elaborate scheme. I was pretty sure any of those approaches would have backfired, would have made me look desperate or vindictive or unable to move on. But more than that, they would have kept me trapped in their story instead of allowing me to write my own. The truth was, Marcus had done me a favor when he told me he never wanted to see me again. He'd forced me to let go of a relationship that was holding me back, a life that was too small for who I was becoming. And by inviting me to their wedding, he'd given me the perfect opportunity to show him exactly what he'd lost. But the real satisfaction didn't come from his regret, or Stephanie's insecurity, or the whispered conversations at family gatherings about how well I was doing. It came from the moment I realized I didn't need their validation anymore, didn't need them to acknowledge what they'd lost or admit that they'd made a mistake. I was sitting in a client meeting about a year after the wedding, presenting a campaign to a room full of executives who were hanging on my every word when it hit me. I genuinely didn't care whether Marcus ever realized what he'd given up. His opinion of me had become irrelevant to my sense of self-worth, his approval unnecessary to my happiness. That was when I knew the revenge was complete, not because I'd destroyed him, but because I'd made him irrelevant. 6 months after that realization, I ran into them at the airport. I was flying back to visit my parents for Christmas, and they were apparently taking some kind of romantic getaway. The encounter lasted maybe 3 minutes. Polite hellos, brief updates on our lives, awkward small talk about holiday plans. Marcus looked older somehow, and Stephanie seemed nervous in a way that suggested their marriage required more maintenance than she'd expected. But what struck me most was how ordinary they seemed. Not villainous, not tragic, just ordinary. Two people who'd made choices that had seemed important at the time, but had led them to lives that looked smaller than they'd probably imagined. I felt nothing when I saw them together. No anger, no sadness, no jealousy. They were just strangers who happened to know some of the same stories about my past. When I walked away from that encounter, I realized that my revenge story had finally reached its proper ending. Not with destruction or dramatic confrontation, but with indifference. With the understanding that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong, it's becoming so successful that their opinions become irrelevant to your happiness. Marcus had told me he never wanted to see me again, and I'd given him exactly what he'd asked for. The woman he'd discarded no longer existed, replaced by someone he'd never get the chance to know. And that, I thought as I boarded my plane to a life that had nothing to do with either of them, was the most beautiful revenge of all.